Our readings for this week illustrate how environmental narratives operate in three distinct domains of global environmental politics. Let's begin with Charles Mann's essay, 1491. In 1491, Mann, a science writer, discusses controversial scientific findings that have challenged prevailing assumptions about the demographic and environmental history of the Americas. To make a long story short, it increasingly appears that the pre-colonial indigenous populations of the Americas were much more numerous and had a much larger ecological footprint than previously imagined. Epidemics of zoonotic diseases carried by the earliest European explorers decimated indigenous populations before most European colonists ever set foot in the New World. This enabled settlers to construct what is often called the pristine myth, or the idea that the pre-colonial Americas were a pristine landscape barely touched by humans. In reality, Mann suggests, this was an illusion created by demographic collapse. This pristine myth, then, overlooks not just the human tragedy of that process, but also the sophisticated techniques that indigenous societies used to modify their environments, often on a very large scale. So what's the problem with the pristine myth today, other than its historical inaccuracy? In very brief, it has deeply influenced strands of environmental thought that ignore indigenous environmental management and assume that protecting natural landscapes means keeping them free of human impacts. Such thinking has in turn informed policies, including our own national park system, that contribute to the dispossession of indigenous peoples and undermine their livelihoods. By extension, the pristine myth also posits that humans must inevitably live in degraded landscapes, with pockets of protected landscapes preserved for research and recreation, usually by elites. This is a very limited way of thinking about the possibilities for environmental adaptations and sustainability. Can you think of examples of how the pristine myth continues to shape environmental politics in the US? Now onto the article by anthropologists Melissa Leach and James Fairhead, who turn our attention to similar debates over how human populations affect forests. Deforestation is a severe, global problem that has accelerated rapidly since the Industrial Revolution, and today plays a major role in climate change, biodiversity loss, and human suffering around the world. Every day, we lose upwards of 80,000 acres of tropical forest to logging, agriculture, and other land uses. But the causes of deforestation are often more complex than we assume, particularly when it comes to the impacts of small-scale farmers. In this article, we find a critique of what the authors call NEO-MALTHUSIAN narratives that see expanding rural populations as an inevitable driver of deforestation. Thomas Malthus was an English cleric and scholar whose life coincided with the Industrial Revolution. I'll leave it to you to read up on his ideas and legacies. For now, suffice it to say that his predictions about population growth and resource depletion have been extremely influential up until the present, even though they have largely been debunked. Focusing on the fascinating case of forest cover change in West Africa, Leach and Fairhead challenge the pervasive assumption that population growth in the region has inevitably led to the degradation and shrinking of the forests. The authors instead invoke Esther Boserup, a 20th century Danish economist who showed that contrary to Malthus's predictions, population growth has led human societies to intensify their land use and develop technologies that increase the carrying capacity of the environment. In the context of forest cover change, a neo-Boserupian perspective would not assume that population growth inevitably leads to forest decline. Leach and Fairhead argue that such a perspective better captures how forests have changed, and in some cases even expanded over the 20th century in West Africa. But even this narrative, they argue, overlooks much of the local level variation, which reflects how particular sites are impacted by political economic processes at the regional and global scales. As you read the article by Leach and Fairhead, ask yourself how uncritically adopting either a neo-Malthusian or a neo-Boserupian environmental narrative could mislead policymakers and disadvantage rural populations. Finally, the article by geographer Diane Liverman turns our attention to climate change. In this article, Liverman engages with three prevailing narratives about the causes, consequences, and potential solutions to climate change. Her analysis in no way challenges the fact that human practices like deforestation and massive fossil fuel use are changing the global climate. Rather, she calls attention to how some of the most influential climate change narratives overlook uneven levels of vulnerability to climate-related calamities how global power relations shape policy decisions, and how market-based solutions are favored to the exclusion of other approaches that might be more effective and equitable. As you read, imagine that you're a journalist or policymaker working on climate change. How would Liverman's analysis affect the stories you write about climate change or the policies that you propose to address it?